Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. My guest today is J L Torres, author of the new short story collection, Migrations. The short story collection is the inaugural winner of the Tomas Rivera Book Prize. JL, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, Jeff, thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if someone hasn't yet heard about your new short story collection, Migrations, can you tell us about one or two of the stories in the collection?
Yeah, okay. I'll start with the one that really gave me the impetus for writing the collection, which is Go Make Some Fire. And it's a story that is based in early 20th century history. And it's about Puerto Ricans, young Puerto Rican adolescents, young men and women, who were sent to the Carlisle Industrial Indian School in Pennsylvania. And that's a notorious, infamous school because it was one of many boarding schools where young, adolescent Native Americans were sent to basically be assimilated into American culture. And I didn't know that Puerto Ricans were sent there. And this is a little bit after the U.S. invaded Puerto Rico. They did so in 1898. So this is maybe 1901, around there. And they were sending these young people to be assimilated, basically. And this school, which was really more vocational school than anything else. And so that's one of them. And it's just about a young man that goes there and the trials and tribulations that he faces, having to experience the fact that, he doesn't feel Indian because unfortunately, a lot of Puerto Ricans by that time, the Taínos, which were the indigenous Indian group in the islands, were, they were pretty much, if not extinct, in terms of our DNA, but extinct in terms of our culture. It had been wiped out. So he's dealing with that, with the fact that he's also a young man trying to figure out the world as a young man, and also the sort of depressive, depressive situation there in that school. And another one that's tied into basically what the collection is about is the one about sterilization of women, which is called The Operation. And it's about a young woman, Elena, who is forced to get this operation, as many of the companies did indeed coerce women who wanted to work and needed to work to get the certificate that they got this operation so it wouldn't affect their work, that they would have to take time off for the kids and stuff. So it's about a woman who is a widow and gets that job only because her husband dies in a horrible industrial accident in a factory, and they sort of feel sorry for her because she's now a widow, and they give her and what she has to do to maintain that job, and to also just now be as a single mother, dealing with two children who are growing up. Those are just two stories, and
Sure.
yeah.
Well, what was your initial writing journey that led you to write and get your first stories published?
Okay, this is the thing, that this was, like I mentioned earlier, that first story about the Indian school. I got an email with an article from a friend at the University of Connecticut who said, you have to read this, article on this school, because we both sort of taught the same material. And I was just astounded that this was happening because I never knew about it. And I said, this is a story. I mean, besides narrative, in terms of historical narrative, is fascinating, but just as a fictional narrative, it would be really great if I could take that, what happened to those young people, and put them in a story. And that's what I did. And then I said, and I got published, that story. And I said, I want to maybe do more of these stories. And there must be other stories within our history that I can sort of make palpable, right, through fiction. And then I started doing the research on that, on the operation, for the operation. And so, and then I realized I had a collection like that.
Well, I'm curious about the writing process for you when you're sitting down to write a new short story. Is it the same from story to story? And when you sit down to write, do you have an idea in mind, or do you just start with a sentence or an image? What's that like for you?
Yeah, I know it's different for all writers. There's not one writing process, but I'm more methodical in my writing. I do believe, because I also teach writing, and I try to follow my own advice to students, right? And I was telling them that pre-writing is a very important part of writing. There are people. I always think of Bukowski, who wrote his one novel, in a week or something, in a flash like this. I am more methodical. I like to really think a lot about what I'm going to write before I begin to write it. So I think, I take notes, I journal, I do a little research, and particularly this collection needed a lot of research, obviously, for history. And then I sort of make a plan for myself. I don't call it an outline because it's too rigid for me. It's a plan. This is sort of, I also think filmically. I think in terms of scenes and how I'm going to connect these particular scenes and the story. And then when I have a good idea that or the direction that I feel comfortable with, I start writing. And then I try to continue. I'm a big fan of I think it was Anne Lamott's short story essay, Shitty First Drafts. I think it was her.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I teach that to my students because I feel like don't be, paralyzed by looking at that cursor blinking and you have nothing. Just write something. And this is why when I have a plan, I know I'm going to start writing because I have an idea, and I know I don't, at that moment, I don't care how bad the first draft is. I just want to get the ideas down. And then it's a layering process for me. I get that first draft, which I'm super happy when I have it. And then I start realizing that I could put more detail here or there, or I have to take this out. This doesn't belong here. Then becomes the editing process. That's my method for writing.
Sure. So what was your MFA experience like?
I've written on this actually. Yeah, I always would think about Junot Diaz, who came even later than me. I got my MFA in 1979 to 1981, and I think I might have been the only Latinx person in Colombia. And then he came later, much later, and he said that the experience wasn't very good for him because he felt he was isolated, and I felt very much like that. And then I'm writing. I remember Ted Salataro, who I really admire a lot, who was a great editor of the New American Library, et cetera. And, I was writing this historical novel, and he was straight out because Ted was a very in-your-face person. He said, "Why are you writing this crap? It's historical stuff, And it had no sense. I would have told him, Ted, with all due respect, this is my life and this is what I want to write about, But I was afraid to tell him that. And I think he felt I should write something more biographically minded because, that was a thing that was happening with Latino writers back there, right? You write about your life and stuff. And I said, no, I want to stick to fiction. And here I am many years later writing historical stuff, right? So I think I was right. But it was the type of thing that didn't understand where you're coming from or and there wasn't enough of us writing and publishing. And this is even before the boom or anybody like people like, Julia Alvarez or Junot Diaz, So it was kind of hard, my experience in MFA. But I did get some good advice, I think it was overly expensive. And sometimes I think people, seriously, I wrote this for there's a wonderful website called the Do It Yourself MFA. And it's a great idea because if you don't have the money, to spend on a 2-year program like Columbia's was, then, and you read a lot and you could do it on your own. You don't need to really get an MFA. But if you're going to teach, you need an MFA.
Yep. So speaking of teaching, and you mentioned that you teach writers, what writing advice would you offer for those who are working on their own stories and novels?
Well, again, it would be different advice, right? For a short story collection as opposed to a novel. If you're writing a short story collection, I really would give the first quick advice is making sure it's thematic because I don't think the collection works as much anymore. I think people like to have some kind of links to the stories, unless they're superb stories throughout, right? And even still, your team will try to find out, we need something to connect these stories, right? Even if they're not connected, because that's the marketing, world that we live in, right? People want to, how do you pitch this, right? And then for novels, you really have to come up with a good idea because there's just so many novels out there pitching. And again, I'm not a genre writer. I cannot give advice to a person who wants to write a detective novel or even historical fiction because even though I write some of that, I consider myself a literary fiction writer, which means that for every novel or story or whatever, a book that I write, it's a completely different idea from the last one. So I have to start from scratch, right? Not like, I don't know, the author that used to write, A is for this, B is for that. I mean, she had 26 books already you know, they crafted, it's crafted. I mean, I don't write
Yes.
that. So, but since when I got, they published the book for A, I got another 24. And so, he says, okay, so now B, what do I do with B, right? And that already is a trigger and a creative, heuristic to come up with the idea for the second and then the third book, whatever. I think you have to read a lot. I think a lot of young writers don't probably read as much as they should. That's another advice. You can learn so much just from reading and read good stuff. Writers are masters, and not because people have declared them, because when you read the book, you realize, wow, this person knows how to write fiction. And so I think that's the first. And then if they came to me with a specific book in mind, then I will give them more specific advice.
Sure. Speaking of reading, are there particular writers that get you excited that you still enjoy reading?
Yeah. I don't have no favorite writer. After different phases, I think it's basically where I'm going through in my writing career. I'm a baby boomer, so I like a lot of young men growing up. Hemingway, I gravitated to Hemingway when everybody wanted to write like Hemingway. And I was very excited about the work that he was doing. And then later on, I realized, oh, this guy had all kinds of issues and problems, and then you read an eye. So, you go through phases. I mean, one time I really thought that Henry James was great, and I thought, believe it or not, here I am, a Latinx, man. And I'm connecting to Henry James. There couldn't be two more different people, right? I mean, This guy was super rich, and he was writing about the rich people, and I'm writing about, working class people, maybe more or less. And
Hi, this is Jeff, host of the Reading and Writing podcast, and I have another podcast that I want to tell you about. Don't Make It Weird. It's a podcast about storytelling, hosted by two authors and produced by a man who's exhausted from babysitting them. This podcast is guaranteed to have you in stitches and probably a bit tipsy if you participate in their audience-tailored drinking game. Listen for writing tips and jaw-dropping, ridiculous, and true-life stories. The video version is available on YouTube and the audio version on any of your favorite podcast apps. Check out the Don't Make It Weird podcast today at dmiwpodcast.com. That's the Don't Make It Weird podcast. Check it out today at www.dmiwpodcast.com. Don't make it weird.
And oppress people. And what is, back then, what was I thinking? And I think maybe it was just his style. I think that, and this is my own theory, I think a lot of Latinx writers, if they read a lot of Latin American writers and Spanish writers, and I read a lot in Spanish also, the style is longer. The sentence seems to go longer. And I like to write longer sentences. I think there's something about a sentence that is well connected and is held together, even though it has several ideas in it. There's a beauty in that. And I think Henry James did that really well. But then I read some of his other books and I said, I can't stand reading this. I mean, I tried to read The Ambassadors. I can't get through the first 3 pages. I couldn't. I had no patience. So again, there's been writers all throughout. I guess the quick answer to your question is I've been through different phases where I really love certain writers. For instance, Bernard Malamud was one of the first primary influences in my life. And I don't know if you're familiar with his work. A lot of people have kind of forgotten about him, which is really sad. But Bernard Malamud was a wonderful American writer from Jewish ancestry. And he wrote a lot about the Jewish American experience. And I just gravitated to him because I felt that this is a person that's not writing your typical sort of, Anglo, American. He's writing from a different community. And I had not read Latinx literature to that point. I didn't even think that Latinx literature existed. Okay. And so I felt very certain affinities to that, and I felt the certain suffering that the Jewish community felt. I felt a connection there. And then I read Pee Wee Thomas's book. He was a Afro-Puerto Rican, and he read Down These Mean Streets, which was the first book that I read. Oh, wow, this is a guy like me. He's writing about, Puerto Ricans, the Puerto Rican community that I was growing up in. And I realized, of course, I didn't have the same affinities to him, I mean, more so than Malamud, but because he was, he was he was in gangs, and he had a very violent life, and
Sure.
he was a drug addict and all that kind of stuff. And I had none of that in my life, but I still connected to the fact that the scenes in particular about his family, I definitely had affinities there because it was very Puerto Rican, his background. So again, different people. Edward Rivera is another writer, family installments early on. There, I was closer to Edward Rivera than Peary because he was a guy that he was very good in school, like I was, He was nerdy in that sense. He read a lot, and he loved. You can tell that this is a sort of a Roman Kunstlerroman, right? A book about a writer growing up, and he went through a whole Catholic school thing, and being poor and working class, and it was definitely better written than P.D. Thomas. It was a beautiful book, actually a beautifully written book. And I felt, wow, this guy can write. And that's one of the people that kind of make me want to write. So as you can see, those are people that had connection. I go through phases. And right now, for instance, I really like, I like a lot of Luis Alberto Urrea's work. And I was so proud that he picked my book for Migrations, because he was the one that chose it. He was the judge. And because I also like his work, I feel like there's certain, maybe that's why he picked it, because I really feel like I have certain affinities to his writing style and some of the way he handles the stories that he writes.
That's great. So you're referring to the prize that Migrations won, the Tomas Rivera?
Right. He was the judge.
Okay. And how did you discover that you had won that prize?
Well, I first got a phone call, actually, and my wife picked it up, and she said, because he was going to tell the information to him. I said, no, he said, you got to tell him this yourself. So, and then he, and it was Luis Espinosa. He says, I know, I just want to tell you that, you won the prize. I said, oh my God. And I got to tell you, I really got a little choked up because, this is later in my career, and I had never won any award or anything. So it was very powerful. And I cried a little bit. I'll be honest with you. I just think that it's great to get that kind of validation after you've worked so hard, and you do it because you love it. But it's nice for people to say, hey, you're kind of good at this. It kind of is a nice feeling.
That's great. Well, you mentioned earlier you're talking about reading. I'm just curious if someone is listening and is not that familiar with Latinx fiction or Puerto Rican diaspora fiction, are there like 2 or 3 authors that you would recommend that someone could go and explore and read more?
Oh, Jeff, that's so hard because we're talking about 500 years of literature.
Sure.
And it's really, which people don't realize, they think it's just a 20th century thing. No, it goes way back. So well, for the Puerto Rican, the quick answer is the Puerto Rican. Quite frankly, if they want, they can read. I wrote a listicle, which is a sort of an article with a list of the 5 books that I would recommend for somebody to start getting involved in the literature of the Puerto Rican diaspora, right? Which is literature written by Puerto Ricans, writers from away from Puerto Rico, living in the States. Yep. So they can read that. And that's in, I think, what's his name? Ben Fox's website, which is the Shepherd for Writers or something like that. I don't remember it, but they can
Google your name and
Google it, right?
The keywords. Yeah.
Right. And then when it comes to Latinx literature, I would say, if you like a 19th century type writing, the Squadron de Don, or the Don, by Maria Ruiz de Burton, Ruizde Burton, Burton. And she was, to me, quite frankly, better than Beecher Stowe as a writer of political satire in the 19th century. And that book is about, how Americans really took over land that belonged to the Californian Mexicans after the Mexican-American War. So if you like historical, that's good. And then P.D. Thomas is important work, I think, also because he was sort of writing that sort of 60s, Mansion on the Promised Land kind of thing from a Puerto Rican perspective. I would tell anybody to read Junot Diaz right now, because Junot Diaz is probably one of the best writers in Latinx literature right now. But there's just so much material.
Sure.
It's really hard to pick. Oh yeah, by the way, speaking of Tomas Rivera, just one more. Tomas Rivera, who the prize was named after, is another who wrote a very important book called "And the Earth Did Not Devour Him," which is about migrant workers in I guess the 50s and 60s. That's a very important book. And also Pocho, Pocho by Villaseñor, which is about a young man growing up. This is one of the first books like that, dealing with the Mexican-American experience. So those are a few books that they can maybe look to get into it.
Sure. Well, are you working on new short stories or a new novel now?
Yeah, I'm working on a novella, to be more specific. And it's about Roberto Clemente. I don't know if you're a baseball fan, but Roberto Clemente is a Hall of Famer, Afro-Puerto Rican baseball player.
Sure.
Who was a great humanitarian. In fact, he died in a tragic trip to Nicaragua, Managua, when there was a earthquake there, to bring supplies and foods, and the plane crashed, and that's how he died. And so he's loved by a lot of people. Puerto Ricans idolize him. But the book is really more about racism, Puerto Rican, and how we deal with racism, and the fact that we are, even though we're a very mixed society, multiracially, that we have our own problems with race and racism. So it's using him sort of as a fulcrum, as a way to jump into the issue. And there's other interesting elements in it. He really is dead where the book is going on. The story is about him after he dies. And, sort of he meets all these Puerto Rican historical figures, and he engages with them in dialogue or whatever, because he's sort of stuck in this limbo, in this world where he can't seem to move on to wherever he has to go after he dies, And so that's what I'm working on right now.
Gotcha. Do you remember when you originally got interested in writing fiction? What were some of your earliest efforts, and what got you started years ago writing fiction?
I really started as a poet, Jeff. I was really my Spanish was not the best, and I felt embarrassed about that. And so I took Spanish courses as my second major when I was in college. And then I just fell in love with Latin American poetry. I just in Neruda in particular, I just was amazed by it. So I started writing poetry, but then, I also, then came the boom, the Latin American boom, and I started reading some of those writers. And boy, that blew me away. And I just felt so inspired to write, because it was really Latin American writers that really inspired me to write. There were really good writers like, Garcia Marquez and Anaya. Well, he's, Anaya is actually Mexican American, but Borges, who I loved when it comes to short stories. So that really turned me on. And that's when I started then shifting a little bit more to fiction. And when I entered Columbia, I actually submitted fiction for my, by then I had decided I wanted to be a fiction writer.
The historical novel that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. I stuck with it, and then I just threw it in the garbage one day after that. And then I wondered there was something in there could have really fixed or something, I said, I'm just not good enough at this point. I'm going to start from scratch, so interesting.
Sure. Well, where can people find you online if they want to learn more about you and your writing?
Well, I have an author website, which is, J L Torres, writer.com. And they can find a lot of information there. I'm trying to keep it up to date, and everything that's happening with me is right there. And they can follow me on Facebook at Rican Writer. Those are the main two. I'm on Twitter also with the same handle, Rican_writer. If they want to follow me that way too.
That's great. Well, again, we've been speaking with J L Torres, author of the new short story collection, Migrations. The collection is the inaugural winner of the Tomas Rivera Book Prize, and the collection is on sale now. So go buy a copy. And JL, thanks for doing this interview.
Oh, thank you for inviting me again.
Absolutely. Hi, this is Jeff, host of the Reading and Writing Podcast, and I have another podcast that I want to tell you about. Don't Make It Weird. It's a podcast about storytelling, hosted by two authors and produced by a man who's exhausted from babysitting them. This podcast is guaranteed to have you in stitches and probably a bit tipsy if you participate in their audience-tailored drinking game. Listen for writing tips and jaw-dropping, ridiculous, and true-life stories. The video version is available on YouTube and the audio version on any of your favorite podcast apps. Check out the Don't Make It Weird podcast today at dmiwpodcast.com. That's the Don't Make It Weird podcast. Check it out today at www.dmiwpodcast.com. Don't make it weird.